Hello, top drivers. In this video, we'll dive into bump stops, what they are, what they're used for, and how to exploit them on high downforce cars to extract maximum performance. The bump stop, commonly referred to in Italian as the end of travel buffer, is an elastic element positioned at the end of a suspension stroke. Its purpose is to limit maximum compression travel and protect the chassis, tires, and mechanical components from violent impacts at full suspension travel. They come in various shapes, lengths, and diameters depending on the vehicle's needs. Short cylindrical, conical, or shaped, long and soft, short and stiff, and so on. The material they're made of determines both their progressivity and stiffness. Compact rubber bump stops provide a relatively soft, linear behavior and are typically used on road cars. Polyurethane bump stops, being stiffer and more progressive, are often fitted on sports cars. Advanced elastomer bump stops, high-performance polymer materials engineered to deliver more controlled and predictable behavior compared to traditional rubber or polyurethane, are the standard in racing cars, allowing very precise suspension control. By carefully setting both the length range and stiffness rate of the bump stops, engineers can control the engagement point and progressivity of their action, effectively managing ride height to maximize aerodynamic load. As just mentioned, the bump stop material dictates how the resisting force increases with compression once the suspension engages them. Some bump stops are linear, providing a constant increase in stiffness. Others are progressive, meaning their stiffness grows exponentially as they approach the end of travel. On road cars, the main purpose of bump stops is to act as a safety cushion. They limit maximum suspension travel and prevent harsh mechanical contact when hitting a big bump or pothole. In simple terms, the bump stop is a buffer with much greater stiffness than the mainspring, specifically designed to offer high resistance in the final millimeters of travel and prevent component damage when full compression is reached. In race cars, however, beyond their protective function, bump stops also take on an active role in the vehicle's dynamic behavior. If, during track driving, the suspension reaches the bump stop, it acts as a sort of secondary spring, working in parallel with the main one. In other words, once the bump stop is engaged, the total stiffness of the suspension increases, sometimes drastically, because the mainspring force is now combined with the very high stiffness of the bump stop itself. This means that, if properly exploited, bump stops can be used as a tuning tool. By progressively adding stiffness only when the suspension compresses past a certain threshold, they allow you to adjust the car's setup conditionally in response to extreme load situations. For example, using bump stops that engage, that is, begin to compress, at a specific ride height can help limit or encourage rear squat under acceleration or front dive under braking without resorting to excessively stiff springs in all conditions. In essence, bump stops allow you to run a relatively soft mainspring, perhaps to improve mechanical grip during normal driving phases. But once a certain compression point is reached, the stop contributes additional progressive stiffness to keep body and floor movements under control. Another key benefit of bump stops is that they make the suspension response progressive as it approaches the end of travel. Without them, the suspension would maintain nearly constant stiffness until hitting an abrupt, rigid stop, something potentially destabilizing. Bump stops instead create a transition zone. The more they compress, the more non-linear resistance they generate, softening the final impact. This is why they are often described as an auxiliary spring, extremely stiff, that only comes into play during the last centimeters of travel. Naturally, they must be calibrated so that under normal driving conditions, they never come into contact, engaging only in high-load situations such as heavy braking or fast, sweeping corners, when the springs and anti-roll bars alone are no longer sufficient to control body motion. Indeed, in low and medium-speed cornering phases, or over small bumps and moderate load transfers, the suspension works only on the mainspring and the anti-roll bar. In these cases, the bump stop remains completely inactive, leaving the suspension with its full usable travel. That's why bump stops should come into play only when vertical or lateral loads become so high that the suspension compresses beyond a certain point. For instance, under heavy braking, the front end dives significantly, risking running out of travel. In high-speed corners, the car undergoes strong lateral compression and roll increases. When hitting curbs aggressively or landing after a jump over a crest, the suspension compresses rapidly and violently. In these situations, bump stops come into play because they limit the maximum usable suspension travel, preventing the suspension from slamming into full compression harshly. In high downforce race cars like LMDH prototypes, this phenomenon is especially important because the impact can generate extremely high vertical load spikes, amplified both by speed and by aerodynamic downforce. In all these cases, the bump stop acts like a progressive secondary spring, initially soft, then increasingly stiff as it compresses. In this way, it prevents mechanical bottoming, stabilizes the aerodynamic platform, and keeps ride height within optimal values. On the flip side, if the stop is engaged too often, the car essentially rides on an extremely stiff element, losing suspension travel and grip. That's why it's crucial that bump stop engagement is confined only to extreme scenarios. High downforce cars, such as LMDH prototypes or even Formula One, rely heavily on bump stops as an integral part of their setup. The reason lies in aerodynamics. As speed increases, downforce grows exponentially, proportional to the square of speed, and pushes the car closer to the ground, drastically reducing ride height. Without countermeasures, at high speeds, these cars would squat too much, potentially bottoming out, which reduces aerodynamic efficiency and can cause damage. This is where bump stops come in. By setting them to engage before the car actually touches the track, engineers can control chassis squat at high speeds, maintaining a minimum safety ride height. In practice, bump stops function as supplementary springs against aerodynamic load. At low speeds, the car rests on the mainsprings, softer to maximize mechanical grip. While at high speeds, when aero compresses the suspension heavily, the bump stops begin to work, making the suspension much stiffer. This prevents bottoming, constant floor impacts with the asphalt, while allowing the use of lower, stiffer setups only when needed without excessively compromising drivability at lower speeds. Before continuing with the video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to stay updated on all our content. And if you'd like to share your passion for sim racing, join our Facebook group, Università del SimRacing. Back to the video, let's look at a concrete example. In an LMDH prototype running down a straight at 300 kilometers per hour, the aerodynamic load can amount to several times the car's static weight, compressing the suspension by multiple centimeters. Bump stops are tuned to provide strong resistance right at those compression levels, effectively supporting the car. By using taller bump stops, you reduce the available free travel and the stops engage earlier. Conversely, shorter bump stops increase suspension travel before contact. It's quite common to adjust bump stop configuration to suit the needs of a circuit. For instance, taller bump stops on ultra-fast tracks, engaging earlier to keep the car higher in slipstream conditions, or shorter stops on slower, rougher circuits to maximize usable suspension travel and improve mechanical grip. This fine-tuning allows engineers to control both ride height and chassis balance under the extreme stress of high aerodynamic loads. It's important to note that a bump stop, once compressed, does not distinguish how the suspension has reached that point. Once it engages, it stiffens that wheel whether in pitch, symmetric axle compression, such as underbraking or acceleration, or in roll, asymmetric compression and cornering. This can be problematic. The moment the bump stop engages, it alters load transfer between wheels. Once the outside suspension hits the stop, any additional vertical load is progressively redistributed to the other wheels still free to move. For example, if the front right bump stop engages, the extra load is shifted progressively to the rear right wheel until the forces balance. This sudden change can reduce available grip. In practice, the car leans on the stop and loses part of its compliance. Insufficient suspension travel combined with an overly stiff bump stop leads to loss of grip and control, as reaching end of travel prematurely creates an overly soft initial phase, followed by a very abrupt final phase, with a sharp drop in stability over bumps and in corners. The result is a more nervous, less forgiving car at the limit. In addition, bump stops are designed to control the roll center and prevent the suspension from exceeding its travel limits. If this were to happen, the suspension could compress to the point of fully closing, causing the roll center to rise abruptly. Roll would be reduced, but at the cost of very fast and non-progressive load transfers with a negative impact on stability and overall grip. However, when bump stops come into play, the outside suspension becomes much stiffer. Visible roll decreases, but load transfer does not disappear. It must be redistributed. Part of it is shifted laterally to the other wheel on the same axle, and another portion propagates diagonally through the chassis, loading the rear wheel on the same side. This effect, known as cross-weight, leads to an uneven distribution of loads, and therefore to a reduction in total grip. We must always remember that load transfer is not the result of roll, but rather the opposite. When an axle becomes particularly stiff due to bump stop engagement, the load transfer tends to concentrate more heavily on that axle. While the total load transfer remains unchanged, bump stop activation modifies its distribution between the front and rear. The stiffened axle, which absorbs a greater share of the load, will therefore show less roll, while the softer axle will experience more pronounced roll. In general, a softer setup allows the car to roll more, but also enables load transfer to occur more gradually through springs and anti-roll bars, using the elastic channel. This is an advantage because the tires can maintain a better contact patch and preserve more grip. Conversely, a stiffer setup or a suspension that reaches the bump stop too early reduces roll but shifts a greater share of load transfer through the suspension's geometric channel. This makes the transfer sharper and less progressive, with the result that one tire becomes overloaded while the other unloads. More roll means more grip but a less stable platform. Less roll means less grip but a more stable platform, an aspect particularly useful for aerodynamics. Bump stops therefore represent a compromise. They prevent the car from bottoming out and help control ride height, but if they engage too early or too harshly, they can significantly reduce mechanical grip and alter dynamic balance through cross-weight effects. In particular, if the bump stop being engaged is on the outside front, the car will tend to understeer. If instead the outside rear bump stop engages, oversteer will be accentuated. For this reason, engineers always try to avoid bump stops interfering with roll. For example, in the DTM Class 1 Championship, the regulations mandated very stiff standard bump stops. Teams made every effort to prevent them from ever working in cornering conditions, because if they engaged during roll, they would introduce sudden increases in stiffness with negative effects on predictability and driver confidence. So how do you solve the dilemma of having aerodynamic support without penalizing mid-corner performance? The solution adopted on prototypes in Formula One cars is the use of the third element, also called the third spring or heave spring, from the heave motion of vertical displacement. This is an additional spring mounted on each axle, one at the front and one at the rear, that only reacts to symmetric movements. Compression of both, it can be fitted with its own spring, often stiffer or progressive, and its own dedicated bump stop. In real LMDH cars, this third element is present both at the front and rear, with bump stops tuned specifically to sustain aerodynamic loads at high speed. This way, when the car is pressed toward the ground by downforce, the third spring and its central bump stop compress and take on most of the load, while the corner springs still retain some free movement, ready to absorb bumps and maintain grip through corners. This approach allows the setup to remain stable at high speed without the four-corner bump stops locking out the suspension in corners. In summary, in high downforce prototypes, the philosophy is to work the bump stops and progressive springing hard on the third element in heave while leaving some margin on the conventional corner suspensions to deal with roll. And that's it for this video. If you enjoyed our deep dive, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss future content. And make sure to join the UniSimRacing community to share your passion for virtual motorsport.